Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in today. Welcome to It's Time for More Injury Funding, the podcast for all who want to learn about legal funding and its significance in the personal injury, wrongful death, immigration, medical malpractice, and many other types of law practice domains. I'm your host, Laura, founder and CEO of More Injury Funding, the legal funding counselors with passion for law, medicine, legal funding, and heart for all suffering individuals. More Injury Funding is a sponsor, member, associate, or business partner of this podcast, State Bar of Georgia, Academy of Truck Accident Attorneys, Sandy Springs Bar Association, Georgia Association of Paralegals, Atlanta Legal Aid Society, and Georgia Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. In today's episode, we have a guest from Kansas, attorney Rachel Smith, founder and the managing partner of the Injury Law Associates based in Prairie Village, Kansas. Sarah is known not only in the state of Kansas, but rather nationwide for her multi-million-dollar settlements and verdicts. Today, we will discuss specifically 3 TBI cases and how Rachel and her team prepared for them. The first would be $3,500,000, and that is premises liability with traumatic brain injury. Second one, $1,250,000, and that is a settlement of a claim involving sexual assault of a minor. And the third case is $1,800,000, settlement of a head-on car crash with TBI. Welcome to It's Time for More Injury Funding podcast, Rachel. It's so good to have you with us today.
Thank you for having me, Laura. I appreciate it.
You got some astonishing results on your recent TBI cases. Can you share details about the last 3 7-figure results for traumatic brain injury cases?
Sure. About, probably 5 or 6 years ago, we really started to make it a point to learn about the science as we watched it develop. And I think that one of the biggest benefits for our practice area is the advancement of science as it relates to concussion identification and treatment out of the NFL. So I think that really opened the door for people to embrace and acknowledge the existence of these kinds of injuries. And when that started happening, there were more opportunities to learn about how to appropriately diagnose, how to appropriately treat. And I feel like the science is changing, probably not daily, but certainly monthly, annually. And so there are a lot of keys to doing it and doing it well. And I only regret that I didn't know sooner what we have learned over the last decade. So when we meet with clients, one of our first tasks is really to evaluate not only what they come to tell us they think the problem is after a truck crash, car crash, whatever the incident is, but also to listen between the lines. And so I have a lot of folks come in and say, in fact, I had a call this week and the client led with, well, I don't have a brain bleed. I went to the hospital and they said, I don't have a brain bleed. So when someone says, I was told I don't have a brain bleed, it triggers a series of questions that we need to ask to investigate what really happened and has the potential client been properly diagnosed. Because ultimately, I tell my clients, there are 2 journeys that you're on. One is your wellness, your recovery, your health. And that ought to walk parallel to your legal case. It doesn't always, but first and foremost, we want to make sure the people that we interact with are getting the care that they need so they can make the best recovery possible. Secondary to that is how well we can work up their injury and do the best job possible, but their ultimate recovery has to be the top priority. So if somebody comes in and tells me an ER doc has sent them home because the traditional diagnostic scans aren't showing a brain bleed, that doesn't mean there's no head injury. It means let's look deeper because something happened for them to even need to do that exam. And so in that case, I say, okay, who have you seen? What are your symptoms? And a lot of times people are going to report lack of concentration, headaches, sleeplessness, vertigo, dizziness. In the more severe cases, you referenced one of those settlements that we had in the last couple of months. when I went to visit my client for the first time at his home, he was a referral from an attorney colleague, and his speech was so impaired several hours to get through the initial interview because he could not say more than probably 3 or 4 words a minute. And obviously, we took all of the time in the world to be patient and listen, and he had to have a myriad of therapies around that speech aphasia, around his own vertigo, balance issues, etc. And we worked on that case for over 5 years because A, his recovery was long and slow. B, COVID happened in the middle. So we lost our trial date probably twice. And ultimately, defense attorneys tried to allege that because he went back to work in a serious government job, he wasn't badly injured. There are a lot of different ways in the medical realm to prove a brain injury, and there are some very sophisticated scans, and they're not universally accessible. They're not typically used in an emergency room, but a lot of times it's a compilation of different kinds of treatments that sort of add up to the whole diagnosis. And so we always make sure that if someone is having symptoms of a brain injury, that they, follow a traditional path and see the neurologist. But a lot of times the neurologist is going to see someone once every 6 months. But then the speech pathologist, the various therapists who are going to be able to speak to whether there are balance issues, dizziness issues. We like to have our clients see a vision specialist because a lot of times brain injury manifests in changes to the way people see, and that can be an objective finding as well as auditory changes. And so it's crucial to make sure that folks see a wide range of specialists where appropriate, so that those experiences and symptoms can be identified, diagnosed, tied back to the brain injury where appropriate. And sometimes that's extra challenging because often clients with brain injuries also have heightened emotional experiences of frustration. It's a lot of appointments, it's a lot of uncertainty, it's a lot of time and energy that's going into trying to prove an injury that they know that they're having. And that kind of dovetails into the other really important piece, and that is spending time with the client in their home, if possible, around their work, near their work, right after work, and talking to the people with whom they work. And so we always, from the very beginning, try to help a client navigate creating a list of people with whom they interact before and after the injury, who can speak to it. And obviously, the easiest people are going to be the spouse, the children, people in the home, but sometimes the most compelling are going to be people who are a couple of steps removed. And we tried a case a couple of years ago. It was a brain injury case, and some of the most powerful testimony came as a result of time we spent sitting in our client's kitchen. He showed us his bedroom. He said, every morning I wake up and I put both of my feet on the ground, and I'm not sure whether I'm going to be able to stand or I'm going to be dizzy and fall back onto the bed. And I don't think he would have told us that story if we hadn't been in that space, just kind of hanging out with him. But in that same case, we ended up interviewing and calling a number of people he worked with who were on the maintenance crew for the city parks and rec. And a lot of them had good things to say, but when his boss came in, and this is we're actually located in Kansas City, Missouri, and practice all over Kansas and all over Missouri. And so this is a Clay County, Missouri trial, and that's a little bit of a rural environment. And so his boss comes in from work. It's December. He's got on his big Carhartt overalls and a big beard, and he comes in and he gets up on the witness stand, and we inquire and we say, sir, tell me how our client has changed. He said, well, Gene used to be our best employee, and I never had to double check his work, and he was always reliable, top notch. And now, we have to go and sometimes clean up after him and sometimes redo some things. And, he went on to give some great testimony. And the defense attorney got up and said, well, have you ever written him up? No, sir, I haven't written him up. Well, isn't that your policy, sir? Isn't it your policy to write him up if he's not doing his job? And he looked at the defense lawyer and he looked at the jury and he said, it might be the company policy, but it's not the human policy. It was really powerful. And I wonder to this day, if we hadn't managed to get him there, whether we would have gotten the verdict that we got, which was just under $1 million. It's not as sexy as some of the other results we've gotten in the last few months. But in that county, the judge said, I think the jury was afraid to cross $1 million, but way to put on a great case. And it was 10 times what they'd offered. So we felt like it was a win for sure. And the key is not only identifying those people very early, but shoring up the stories and getting their commitment to come to trial. Because the last thing you want to do is all of the important briefing and motions in limine and getting your exhibits all done. And then you're like, wait, did anybody tell the lay witnesses that the trial's next week and we want them on this date at this time? And then finding out somebody's on vacation and somebody else can't get off of work and you don't have enough time to create a subpoena. And I think those before and after witnesses are incredibly compelling. So one of the cases we just resolved a few months ago, right before trial, was a premises case with a brain injury, and she lived out of the country. And so I flew to Australia and I spent a week talking to my client's closest friends, people she had worked with, her family. I had meals with her and her daughter. We went to the zoo. We spent the whole week together. And I feel like I gained a friend for life, as well as the opportunity to really connect, to build trust, to let her know that despite everything she had been going through for the years that preceded the trial after the injury, to make sure she understood that we believed her, we were behind her, but also the stories that I heard from her friends that she had known since the 8th grade. Some people who she was mom friends from her daughter's school, people who could talk about how she went from being the most effective ER nurse, moving into nurse consulting, school mom, engaged parent, to somebody who couldn't get out of bed, couldn't hold down a job, didn't remember to pick up her daughter from school. Many of those stories were heartbreaking, but I wouldn't have been able to get that information by email or even by phone calls. And we had a hemisphere between us, and it really required being there, looking someone in the eyes, letting them know that we were there advocating for their friend, their colleague, their coworker, their daughter, so that they felt comfortable to tell us stories about how much her life had changed and what that meant and what it was worth, so that we knew how hard we had to fight on this end to obtain full justice for her.
Just amazing. How, Rachel, did you and your legal team prepare for these traumatic brain injury cases to ensure a favorable result?
Generally, we make a point to try and follow the literature, try and attend the national conferences, I have co-counseled with people I recognize to be industry leaders because I want to learn their techniques. I want to see how they identify experts, how they're crossing defense experts. I think co-counseling is always an opportunity to learn. And I would be a fool to think that I ever didn't have more to learn. I try to surround myself with people who are doing what I perceive to be a better job than I am, so that I can learn their techniques and tricks. Trial by human is a philosophy that our firm is devoted to. I think the instructors, leaders, Nick and Courtney Rowley are amazing. I have co-counseled with Teresa Hatch, and that was an incredible experience working on one of these brain injury cases. And from that, we recognize and know that preparation is key. That's true in every case, but certainly in these complex cases where you really, really have to know the client, know their world, know their friends, know their family, know their coworkers. That's not something you can do a few weeks before trial. It's an investment you make from the minute you sign up the case. Then it is getting great experts, making sure that they have everything in front of them that they need to do a full evaluation, that they know the client's stories, that if they need more information, we get it. So we're not just sending a file off and hoping that whatever conclusion they reach is sufficient. It's making sure that all of the pieces of the human story are incorporated through expert reports and into everything that we are presenting, first to adjusters, then to defense lawyers, and ultimately the jury, so that they can see the whole picture and not just a person who looks okay because, you know, they aren't missing a limb, they're not in a wheelchair, but the brain is the most important organ running all of our systems. And when that gets damaged, the fallout can be incredibly dramatic and terrible.
Absolutely. And no settlement really comes without challenges and a measurable amount of stress. What challenges did you and your team face in these cases, and how did you overcome them?
Well, one of the biggest challenges always is coverage. And so we always consider ourselves lucky when we can find adequate coverage to find full justice for our clients. There are a lot of situations where there simply isn't enough coverage in serious injury cases, but also folks with traumatic brain injuries can be a little erratic sometimes, emotional. We've had people get frustrated with the process. We've had people who don't always remember conversations that we've had. And so in brain injury cases, we try to make a point of backing everything up by email. Here's what we talked about. Here's what's happened. We've had challenges when a client is employed in the military or government and we can't have access to their coworkers. And there are hoops to jump through there. And the government just said, we're not interested in being part of this process. And when that happens, you need to figure it out early, figure out if there are other ways to get to the kinds of testimony that will support making the case. It is making sure that the experts are all going to qualify under your state or federal rules to testify about everything that you want them to be able to testify about. But the key again is being prepared, anticipating problems. And with brain injured folks, I find when they have an advocate working with them from home, whether it's a spouse, a parent, a child, sometimes it is very helpful because then there's another person in the room listening to you as you talk to your client about issues, challenges, preparation, things like that, to help make sure that they are digesting the information, retaining the information, keeping appointments, things like that, because sometimes those folks can be really unpredictable in their responses.
Can you discuss the importance of expert testimony in traumatic brain injury cases?
It's critical because we want the jury to be able to hear both the objective and subjective, and that's where my philosophy is multidisciplinary. It's not a one expert kind of case. It is, who are all of the people touching this person who is trying to retrain a part of their brain and their body to recover from whatever injury has occurred. And that's where it may be an occupational therapist, speech therapist, audiologist, a neurologist. You want to pull them all together because they're all touching the client in different places, and they stack like bricks in a house, or bricks in a wall rather, to demonstrate how it has affected so many facets of a person's life, and all of the specialists who are going to be needed to put that person back together.
Mm. And how would you say the expert testimonies played a role in these three specific cases?
Well, it undermines the defense's ability to claim malingering, exaggeration, etc. In Australia, they have a very robust medical system that's more responsive to traumatic brain injury than I think what we typically see in the United States. And she had an incredible cadre of medical professionals, her primary care being one of the first who said, we knew her before. Now, a lot of specialists had never seen her because she didn't have problems, but her primary care doctor, who I met with in person when I was over there, said she never even called in sick, ever. She was, the kind of person who said, give me something that makes it possible for me to go to work. But she went from that kind of person to the kind of person who had multiple neuropsychologists, neurologists, physical therapists, occupational therapists. She had equine therapy. She had psychologists, psychiatrists across the board. And for them to suggest that all of these people were simply indulging someone who woke up one day and decided that she didn't want to be a successful medical professional anymore, she didn't want to be an engaged parent anymore, was really absurd. But it was crucial to have them all lined up and acquainted with the overall treatment and with one another's treatment. And a lot of them were interfacing anyway, but it's helpful, in my opinion, not to have somebody going cold, having no idea what some other treater is doing when you're trying to paint a full picture.
And what strategies did you employ to prove the extent of the brain injury and its impact on the victim's life? Can you, Rachel, dissect one or more of your cases here?
Sure. So when I think of that case, as someone who is a mother of a similarly aged child, it really struck close to home. And I trusted that when we picked a jury, anyone who has a history of raising a child, being fully engaged, wanting the best for their child, would be able to relate to that piece and the grief that our client experienced when she stopped being able to keep track of the calendar or her keys or remember to turn the oven off. And when I spent time with them, I saw that her 14-year-old daughter was making her tea in the morning and helping her find her way to her appointments and making her own lunch and reminding her mom, I here's what I've done. I fed the dog. Here's when I'll be home. And really had reversed the parenting role. And the fact that my client was astute enough to recognize that happening, and the guilt that she felt about that was so powerful, touching, tragic. And she was 5-6 years post injury, and so there wasn't a lot of promise of a big change. And so what we tried to do was have the people close in her life illustrate that, but then we had the experts or psychologists or psychotherapists talk about how does that affect a single parent who had been a great mom and had been really proud of how she raised her daughter and was taking care of her. And then combine that with someone who went from being the top of her career. Similarly, my guy who worked in government was the head of a department and up for a promotion, and identified his success through his military experience that had translated into a job with the federal government, and his pride in protecting his country and running this department, his ability to stand on his feet, and to talk to his subordinates who said, don't tell him we told you, but we're really holding it together for him. And he's able to continue doing his job, but he's not doing it alone anymore. He's relying on us. And to talk to his wife and children, they were close to retirement, and they had built a big house out in the country designed to have all of their grandchildren, mostly boys, rambunctious. They wanted a big Christmas tree, and they had four-wheelers out back, and they were going to do all the fun things, to where now when all the grandkids come over, grandpa has to go into a quiet room 15 minutes in because it's too much noise. It's too much stimulation. It gives him a headache. Everyone's shushing the kids. Like it was stolen. Their dream of their retirement, their dream of, leaving a career with honor and leaving on a high note, and going into this world that you've built to spend time with your family, and all of the time and the money and the savings to build this world for their family that they can no longer enjoy. I mean, how do you put a value on that? I mean, in that case, it ended up being the policy limits. And I contend that, a couple $1 million wasn't enough. But we were often, as I said, constrained by what the limits are and where we are able to recover. And so when people come in, a lot of times, I've got a motorcycle case right now. The guy called me and he had 19 broken bones and a brain bleed. That's a case I'm actively working on. And I said, if I can't find coverage, I'm probably working for free, and I'll do that. I'll find, and by coverage, I meant find real coverage, not a $25,000 policy, not a $50,000 policy. Now, in that case, we found a couple of million, which they're reluctant to pay. And that's fine. I'll go get it, because I will fight to the death for this guy or any of my clients. But you can't ever be whole from that. And I find it offensive that insurance companies think that they ought to get away with a discount when my poor guy was minding his own business, doing nothing wrong. And then, a kid wasn't watching where he was going. And next thing you know, shattered pelvis, multiple spinal fractures, broken right arm, broken left leg, brain injury. So those are the people that we're fighting to protect. To recap, I would say it's important to line up all of the medical professionals, everyone who touches your client, and then to do the same in their world. Everyone who touches and interfaces with your client, who can speak to the changes in their personality, their emotional range, their impulse control, their behaviors. That is how you paint a complete picture of the loss that person has experienced, and even more or as deeply the loss that their family usually experiences when someone's husband, father changes into a different person, a person they don't recognize.
Absolutely. Are there any specific resources or tools that lawyers could and should utilize when preparing for traumatic brain injury cases with high financial stakes?
I would say, if it's not an area of practice that you're familiar with, find co-counsel who is. This isn't the kind of case you want to cut your teeth on by yourself. And there are lots of great national lawyers who would be happy to step in. I would say there are some national conferences, and anyone handling these cases should make a practice of going to the TBI conference in San Diego. I think John Romano is doing one now out of Nashville. But stay on the cutting edge of the science, talk to your local experts, authorities, figure out, what kind of diagnostic scans are available in your area, and also when are they appropriate, because some of the more sophisticated scans are better for detecting damage to the brain later, not right after a crash, but after the brain has healed to the extent it's going to, and then you can see whether there's still white matter or other problems later. Find experienced neuroradiologists to read them. I would not rely on, a scan done in the ER and the radiologist there. They're looking for very traumatic brain bleeds, evident injuries, not the more subtle kinds of things that form what we would call, a mild traumatic brain injury. Read the literature, but it really is paying attention to what the experts are learning on an almost daily basis, so that you're on the edge of the science too.
Okay. Can you, Rachel, discuss any precedent-setting rulings or legal strategies that emerged from these recent seven-figure TBI cases?
Our fights were more fact-oriented than legal-oriented. There were efforts to block the testimony of some of our experts, but the defense lawyers were using geography and distance and whether or not people could testify virtually as a greater barrier. They weren't filing Daubert motions to suggest that they weren't qualified to testify. We had some challenges in the head-on crash because the defendant died, and then you're having to work strategy around having the widow at the table, and we were running focus groups on what is a jury going to think about a large verdict where the poor little lady is sitting at the table, and is a jury going to think that she has to write a check for it since we can't talk about insurance or anything like that. So it really, our strategies were around managing testimony. We had the challenge with the government employees who were prohibited from testifying, and you have to file some very special motions called TUI motions, and the government can just say, nope, we're not interested. And so they blocked us from access to those witnesses. And so we had to figure out a way to get anyone else who wasn't part of that government office to talk about how our clients' capacity had diminished. That was a real challenge. And we had their deposition transcripts, and so we thought we were going to be able to get those in, since we had gotten that before the government put the kibosh on us having access to them. So our challenges were practical, not legal so much. But I could see if we had a case just wrap up that wasn't one of the ones you referenced, but we did have some sophisticated scans done in a trucking case, and it's settled. But I know that the defense was planning on trying to strike our neuroradiologist. and suggest that some of these newer scans are junk science. And that's a fight that's going to happen with anything that's new. And you just have to, make sure your folks know what they're talking about and they can back it up and fight the fight.
And you have so much experience again in this field, and so maybe you can advise how can lawyers build strong relationships with medical experts and specialists to strengthen their traumatic brain injury cases.
I think the two ways to do that are, again, conferences where you'll hear them speak. They'll talk about who they're relying on. You can read those folks, you can correspond with those folks, you can hire those folks, but also either through a co-counsel or consulting relationship with other lawyers who are pursuing these cases successfully, they're going to have inroads to the best experts in the country and getting on, the listservs, paying attention to them, following up with the lawyers. Good lawyers share, and they will share who they've used. And the idea is that a rising tide lifts all ships, and we should be helping each other. So that's what I would do. I wouldn't start with Google.
I love it. How can lawyers effectively present complex medical information to a jury in a way that is easily understandable and impactful?
I think the key to figuring out the answer to that question is partly on a case-by-case basis, but partly also through focus groups, because you have to be able to tell a simple story. The more complicated your story is, the less a jury will be able to follow it. And so I think the key is to practice the presentation in front of, we hire people sometimes through temp agencies, sometimes through Craigslist, and we test. Like, you can present information, you can play video testimony, you could read transcripts, you can show exhibits, and then you ask your focus group, your mock jury, what did you learn? What did you understand? What was confusing? What was not confusing? And you have to understand that a jury is not going to necessarily come with a sophisticated medical or scientific background, and make sure that when you prepare your experts, it's with that in mind. But I find the best test is not what a lawyer thinks of something someone says, but what lay people say. And that's why we try to run it by lay people well before trial, so that we can really get that feedback and provide it to our experts or to ourselves.
And that too, yes. And what role did medical evidence play in establishing liability and securing substantial compensation in one or all of these cases that you recently handled?
If there wasn't medical support for what ended up being very serious brain injuries, the value would not have been there. I mean, both of my clients, or the two that we've been talking about primarily, had other injuries. In one case, a torn rotator cuff, neck, back. I mean, both were in pretty significant, a premises, something fell on my client, fell on her head, but also her neck and her back, and then the head-on crash. And so those we considered actual injuries, but not the focus, because those were things that could be treated and would have a relatively decent recovery, where the evidence was clear, the medical evidence was clear, that in both of these cases, that not only was the injury present at the time of the occurrence, in both cases, there were reports of injury to the head. And in the case of my guy with the head-on collision, he immediately had memory loss, couldn't identify his wife in the hospital, speech aphasia. He was home for 6 months post-crash, trying to relearn to walk, balance. He had ongoing issues with grip, tingling, etc. And so he was a little bit of a challenge, super great guy, but he got frustrated with the process. Like, I'm done going to all these appointments. He was a tough guy. He was a retired military cop. He was, used to toughing things out. And we had to have some conversations about, if you are not documenting your actual medical experience, the progress of your injuries, we can't we can't put it in front of the jury that way. You telling a story about having ongoing problems is different than having your therapist and having the specialist come in and talk about it. And so we had to hold his hand a little bit, but in both that case and the case with my client in Australia, 5 years after the fact, they were both receiving pretty intensive care. And, had we tried to resolve those cases very early, we probably wouldn't have been able to prove how serious the injuries were because of the longevity of those injuries.
And can you share any lessons learned or best practices from these recent TBI cases that can benefit other legal professionals, other attorneys handling similar TBI cases?
I would say our process in the office has changed such that when someone comes in with that kind of an injury, we immediately tag the file and make sure to do extra check-ins with those people. We also start asking very early, who are the people who are caring for you? Who are the people who would be good before and after witnesses? Keep a journal, document how you feel as you progress through each stage of recovery. What are the things you can do, can't do? That can be useful in all cases, but in particularly if you're going to be dealing with folks who have memory and concentration issues and recall issues, having everybody kind of on alert for what you're going to be looking for down the road so that you're really starting to work that up from the very beginning. And then when it comes time to answer discovery, to be preparing for deposition, you have those resources already in place to call upon.
Mm-hmm. And if someone is in need for one of the best traumatic brain injury attorneys, not just in the state of Kansas, but nationwide, how can they locate you, Rachel? Do you have a website, social media resources, email?
My email is rsmith@accidentlawkc.com. My cell is 913-706-0878. I'm happy to be a resource. I'm happy to talk to anybody about anything. And I want everyone handling these cases to get the best success possible for their clients because it's really important. I love what I do, fighting insurance companies who are trying to take advantage of folks who are, going through these terrible circumstances. So we are on the righteous side.
That's so great. Rachel, thank you again so much for finding time to talk with me about finding for change, the stories behind the 3 7-figure results in traumatic brain injury cases, and for being my very special guest on It's Time for More Injury Funding podcast. But before I let you go, I have a fun pop-up question. You ready?
Okay.
What is the best compliment you've ever gotten?
Gosh. I mean, it matters a lot when a client thanks us. So professionally, that's a big deal when somebody says thanks for protecting me. But as a mom, anytime my kids say thanks for being there for me, that wins too. So those are the things that keep my clock ticking, I guess. For fun, I love to cook. So anytime somebody tells me I made them a good meal, I feel like that's a win too. So
that's amazing. Next time I'm in Kansas, I'm visiting you for that special meal.
We'll have some wine, we'll have some food. It'll be great.
I'm ready. I love it. That again was attorney Rachel Smith with Injury Law Associates. I want to thank you all for watching and listening to our story about the fighting for change and the stories behind these the 7-figure results in traumatic brain injury cases. For more tips and tricks on legal funding and personal injury related topics, follow me, like, and subscribe at More Injury Funding. And it's time for More Injury Funding podcast on YouTube, Spotify, Amazon Music, Google Podcasts, and other podcast platforms worldwide. Also on LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Pinterest, YouTube, Google Business Profile, and my website at moreinjuryfunding.com. I can't wait to see you and hear you again, my dear listeners, and viewers again soon. Until then, be well.